This is Morgan D. Mikas interviewing Nancy Hugo. Nancy, how long have you lived in Ashland?
We've lived in Ashland since 1972.
What was the reasoning behind you coming to Ashland?
My family and I had looked for a long time for a farm near Richmond where my husband was working, and we couldn't find a farm that we could afford within driving distance of Richmond, so we compromised and moved into the rural village of Ashland, and it turned out to be a great decision.
Do you still live on a farm or participate in farm activities?
Okay, we moved in 1972 to Maple Street, which was really sort of right in the middle of town, but it had a fair amount of land with it. Then we moved to Center Street in 1997, and just prior to that, we had bought a real farm in Buckingham County, so that's the way we scratched our land itch.
Since you've moved a lot in living on different streets in Ashland, which was your favorite and why?
Oh, that's a hard question because they were so different. Maple Street is where our children were young there, where it was their first contact with Ashland. There were lots of young families there raising children, and we were all friends, and it was just wonderful to share this small town with them. So I have a huge affection for that and a mulberry tree in our backyard that our children used to climb. When we moved to Center Street, that was entirely different. That was one of the Victorian houses. That was a very romantic and sort of exciting house, but probably a little bit too big for my sensibilities. I sort of like cozy better. And now we live in Gwathmey, which is a little bit out of town, a little bit south of Ashland, and a little bit more rural, actually, and we have more land. And here I have a little bit smaller house, more land, sort of. If this had been available when we first moved to Ashland, this would have been exactly what we're looking for. And here again, by that time, we moved here in 1997. By that time, we already had our lifelong friends in Ashland and weren't looking for more friends or wonderful neighbors, but we found them here, a whole new group of people, and we have a sort of nice little community out here, too, in addition to the Ashland community.
You say that you had lifelong friends since you moved here in 1997. Do they still live in Ashland?
Most of them do, yes. The Shalfs and the Watsons have been friends of ours for such a long time, and another one of our close friends has died in the interim. And another very close friend on Maple Street, the Lillian Camps, were good friends of ours, and they're long gone. But lots of them are still here.
Very nice. How many relatives of yours live in Ashland?
None. I'm not, I can tell you how I learned about Ashland first. When I was a child and lived in Richmond, I used to ride the train out. My mother would send me out to spend an overnight trip with, I called her Punky, but her name was Bernice Flowers then. She was later Bernice Levin. But she would pick me up at the train, and I'd spend the night with her and her husband. So that was the way I first experienced Ashland, was a little and of course, like a lot of kids from Richmond, I came out on the Santa train occasionally, but it was those overnight trips with Bernice Levin. Earlier, her previous name was Bernice Flowers, who first showed me Ashland.
What did she show you when you came here? What were the things that you did?
That's really funny. I'll tell you, my strongest memory is not so much of the town, but of the den room where her husband smoked cigars. That was a little sort of a frightening room. It was dark and had one of those stand-up ashtrays that you push the little lever and all the ashes go down. But I do remember her yard, and her yard became important to me when we moved to Ashland. We moved within a stone's throw of her house. We lived on Maple Street, and she lived on oh, what's the name of that street? A little street perpendicular to Maple Street. So we were round the corner neighbors, which was fun. And I've always loved gardening, and I called her Punky. Punky would let me cut. Of course, all my plants were not very mature. Punky had, beautiful Cunningham tree and a beautiful magnolia and lots of bulbs and what else? Cowslips. She gave me my first yellow cowslip, and I would, whenever I wanted to have flowers for the house, I'd go over to Punky's and pick. And that bit of generosity was really neat. So now I'm the old person with the old trees and bulbs, and people come to me.
Wow, that's great. What was your first career in Ashland? What got you started in meeting people?
Okay, let's see. Oh, I've had several jobs in Ashland. My first was as very part-time. I guess I was called director of the Community Cooperative Play School. Some families associated with Randolph-Macon and some local people. We started the Community Cooperative Play School, which is now at the Hanover Arts and Activities Center, in about 1973 probably. My daughter, Kate, was only 18 months old at the time, and the model was that each parent would work a day and, leave your child with some other, you'd work a day and then have a day off when you didn't have to keep your children. And some of the people who participated in that were Carol Wadlin and Jerry Bryce. He was the father who helped, and his daughter Julie and son Toby were among the first children in that little group too. And at that time, for a father to be doing it was sort of radical. And Diane Lillienkamp with her daughter Katie, several other people, but that was the first. Oh, other careers. Hold on. That was the first, and then let's see. Then I taught at VCU for a little while, and then I was the circulation librarian at Randolph-Macon, and then I taught in Caroline, and then I taught at Patrick Henry and at some elementary schools. I coordinated the gifted program in Hanover for a little while.
Since you worked a lot with kids, have you seen them change the types of kids, what they do, what they look like, their education, now that you've been here for so long?
Oh, sure. I'll tell you a funny story about that. And I forgot I was at Atlee the very first year that Atlee High School opened. That was, whoa, I was coming back to teaching after a while away from it, and that was probably the hardest work year of my life. I was split between Atlee and Patrick Henry High School. Whew, what a job. Anyway, the kids, I'll tell you, this, I don't really know the answer to that. The students, the young people that I know who are the same age as the ones I taught seem quite similar and equally wonderful. But I'll tell you a funny story. I can remember a faculty meeting at Patrick Henry, and I'd love to know if Condi Hopkins also remembers this, when she and I we were saying, but we don't want computers. We don't like computers. We want to have a choice in this. And whoever was the technology person at the time was saying, oh no, this is not a choice. This is coming. You can't resist. And of course he was right.
Since you taught at Randolph-Macon and now you're a citizen in Ashland, do you see a separation between the two?
Now, I didn't teach at Randolph-Macon. I was in the library, but I've never experienced that. Maybe people who lived here. I don't know. No, my friends have always included people affiliated with the college and people not. And to me, the college has always been the thing that took a little town and kept it from being provincial. There were always these wonderful events at the college, very few of which I take advantage of now, but still there are people, you can have friends who care about ideas and books and are serious scholars, and that has been incredibly enriching to me. I'm sure that's one of the reasons I like the town so much, is because the college is here.
You mentioned events at the college. Were there any events that stuck out in your mind that had just such wonderful memories from?
Well, now one that I remember that probably nobody else does, and it was at the college. I'm not sure whether it was sponsored by the college, but Nina Peace, who is no longer with us, organized a square dance. I don't know exactly. I guess it was in the gym. And that was so much fun. And I just remember that as being a very unusual, really fun thing. And of course, all the what do you call them? The variety shows at Blackwell have been wonderful. And we went to some of the cultural events and things. None of those stand out quite as much as the square dance and the variety show.
Growing up, having your kids grow up in Ashland, raising your kids in Ashland, how do you think their childhood was? Where is it very, your kids playing with themselves, playing with the community?
We thought it was wonderful. In fact, it makes me so sad now to see kids who can't, wait together on the bus stop without parents, or mine walked to school a lot of the time when they were at Henry Clay. It was so nurturing that one time our dog followed our daughter to school, and all we did, we got a call from the secretary saying, "Bear's here, you better come get him." And of course, I just drive or walk over there and get him. And I have told the story often that I thought they would call me if the hem came out of Kate's skirt. That's how sort of tight it was. Just very familial and wonderful. So yeah, that was good. And I don't know how to compare it to now, but it was certainly wonderful back then.
How old are your children now?
My son is 40 and my daughter's 36.
Have they decided to live in Ashland?
They don't live in Ashland. They both sort of toyed with the idea for a while, but they do live in the area. But one lives in Richmond and the other in Henrico.
What was the parenting roles that you and your husband played in raising your kids?
Parenting roles? I don't know. I would say shared. You mean, was he the disciplinarian and I the something else?
The housekeeper.
Well, actually, he worked right much, and the kids remember something that I don't, which is that he wasn't usually home for dinner. I don't remember that. I always thought he was there, but maybe he wasn't. Like, he did work at night a fair amount. But I'm sure I was home more. I worked most of the time or was in school, but I usually try to get the kind of job that would allow me to be home when the kids were. And so I'm sure I was home more than John, but he was certainly actively involved.
Did you ever influence a religion on your children, or do you practice a religion that's known for Ashland?
Okay. Well, we've been all over the place with religion. I think at the time we moved here, we were Unitarians. And then we started our own little family church, just having our own services at home for a while. That was interesting. Then I visited there was an active Quaker community in Hanover for a while, which I enjoyed. But right now, I suppose I'm a Druid.
Very nice. Where were the places that you used to shop? Do you still shop at those little local markets?
Okay. I pretty much shop in Ashland. I mean, what do I go to Richmond to shop for? Not much. Occasionally go to the mall, but we shop at U-Crops. Oh, I do remember. Now, this is what you want, is things other people might not remember. The Safeway and the A&P were here. And, of course, Crosses has always been here since we were. That was wonderful. Really, the shopping area, the downtown along the tracks where the Iron Horse is nicer now than, it's all so pretty now. I think it's nicer than when we moved here. There was a little 5 and dime. In fact, anyway, right there on the corner where the ice cream, where the club car is now. See here comes a train. That's proves you're in Ashland.
Duke's Market.
Duke's Market, yeah, I miss that being there. I didn't do my grocery shopping there, but I would occasionally stop there on the way home from work and pick up something. Trying to think of other stores. That 5 and 10 store wasn't there much longer after we moved here, but that was fun.
You have a lot of Ashland has a lot of historical buildings. Do you see the town restoring them, or how do you see them dealing with that?
I think the town has done a good job of protecting its old buildings. What's so good about Ashland is the mixture. Not just the wonderful Victorian houses, but the Sears houses and the bungalows. And that's one thing I've always liked about Ashland, that it's all mixed up. There's not a good neighborhood and a bad neighborhood, or a rich neighborhood and a poor neighborhood. It's all mixed up. And that appeals to me.
You said when you would come from Richmond and you would pick flowers and were fascinated with gardening. What do you do now for fun?
Same thing, gardening. It's my favorite thing to do. In fact, I didn't know we were going to have a structured interview, but the things that I remember most about Ashland are, particular trees and shrubs and rose bushes and that kind of thing. When some people notice architecture and other people notice wildlife or something, I just notice the plants. So,
do you have any specific plants that you remember?
Yes, of course, everything in Punky's backyard I knew well, because I used to go over there and cut plants. Sarah Wright still has a wonderful saucer magnolia in her yard, and when we lived right in the middle of Ashland, it was sort of a rite of spring to watch for its petals to fall on the ground. Let's think what else. Oh, Susan Tucker's dark flowered lilacs. There used to be a wonderful old rose growing on the chain link fence that was beside what is now the group home on Virginia Street. I don't know what happened to that. I tried to root it once. Wonderful Japanese maples at Duncan Memorial Church. Oh, the crab apples in Tootie Majette's front yard. And I don't know whether y'all know about the tricycle tree at Randolph-Macon. Well, I think I'm going to write that up there's some tree planting, there's collecting stories, particularly about trees, but there is a tree over behind what used to be Dr. Blinko's house. It's now a fraternity house that has a tricycle up in it, antique tricycle that's been there since 1908. When Dr. Blinko was a little boy, they put it up in the tree to use the rim of its wheel as a pulley to pull things up to their tree house. And now the tree has almost totally covered this antique tricycle, and the tree is huge. It's a willow oak. I'll tell you more specifically where it is. I wish I could think of the name of it's one of the fraternity houses along the railroad tracks. It's not along College Avenue. It's across from, I guess those are soccer fields. Anyway, before you leave, I'll tell you exactly where it is, because you need to go see it.
Ashley used to have carnivals. Did you ever attend the carnivals or go to the movie theater?
I had completely forgotten those carnivals. I have a precious picture of my daughter, wide-eyed, looking at a clown. I'd completely forgotten them. Completely. Yes, we went to the carnivals. The movie theater. Yes, we went to the theater, but it has been a very on and off thing in our tenure here. Sometimes it's operating and sometimes it's not. I actually thought about buying the theater once and went to talk to the owner, and there was about a 2-week period in my life that I thought I was going to run. I I can't believe it, but I actually thought about that for a while.
You mentioned that you would walk to school if your daughter needed something. How else did you get around Ashland? Did you ride?
Truth be told, we probably drove more than we walked, but in our little neighborhood, certainly everybody walked, and the kids could walk to school when we lived. Kate could walk to Henry Clay. It was, mostly they rode the school bus, but yeah, we rode bikes. Ashland is a great, as you know, bicycle town because it's so flat.
You mentioned you rode the train when you were younger. Do you remember any other names of the train services or how the train has changed over the years?
Well, I'll tell you a fun story about the train. Again, the frequency of passenger rail services sort of waxed and waned while we've been here. My most fun train story is I went every year as an adult to New York with friends on the train, and they would usually get on at Richmond, and I would get on in Ashland. But one time, I got on with them at the Staples Mill and went to New York. Huge snowstorm, and on the way back, we asked. At that time, the train did not stop in Ashland. But we asked him on the way back. We were young and cute then, so we had some influence with the guys who worked on the train, and we were just playing around with him, flirting, I'm sure, and said, could they drop me off at my house? And they did. They stopped right in front of my house and dropped me off, which was so much fun. But what was the funniest part was my family had spent all morning digging the car out to go get me. Then they were at the Richmond station waiting for me, which was sort of embarrassing, but it was still neat to have gotten the train to stop right in front of my house.
How about the trolley? Was the trolley around when you moved to Ashland?
The trolley was not around when I moved to Ashland, but you should the trolley, and before that, the electric train, believe it or not. There was something even more monumental before the trolley came. It ran right up here where we live now, is near the old trolley line, and it's just so amazing that wonderful piece of transportation dropped out. That what will we give for it now? I'll tell you what did serve Ashland, though. I forgot to tell you about for a while I worked at the General Assembly, and I rode the bus to Ashland every day. Now that's really interesting to think that Ashland when we first came to Ashland had reliable two kinds of bus service. Both the Greyhound bus stopped here, and there was a sort of a local bus that went to Richmond. And a lot of commuters and people who worked in town rode it. And I rode it back and forth to downtown Richmond every day. And it was really wonderful because nobody could ask you to work late. You had to say, gee, I'd just love to, but my bus leaves at 4:45. But that, it startles me that now, with a bigger need for public transportation than ever, we had it, and now we don't anymore. Anyway.
Have you ever thought of going to council meetings to try and get those transportations back?
Oh, I used to be much more active in politics. I'm sort of embarrassed to say my interests have gone sort of totally to the natural world now and other things. But I do. Not long ago, there was a petition going around to get bus service back. I think the town was going to have to subsidize it, and there was some controversy about it. But I definitely signed it, and I was very much for it. But yeah, I'm afraid I should be more active, but am not on that.
When you weren't active in politics, what were some of the issues that you can remember?
Well, one of the first meetings of Citizens for Sensible Growth, which was sort of our first, to my knowledge, planning environmental group in Hanover, the issues were how fast and in what way was the county going to develop. And the moving force behind that was Margaret Miller, who was sort of a mentor of mine at that time. She was the wife of Dr. Schuyler Miller at Randolph-Macon. Quite I can't think of the right adjective, powerful woman. And we worked really hard with the Planning Commission, with the Water Control Board, with the Town Council, with, every, there goes another train, perfect, with all the appropriate officials to try to influence the comprehensive plan in terms of how the county would develop and how much.
That said, what were your views on Walmart coming here?
I was opposed to Walmart, although I totally understand the fact that they do have inexpensive things that, make life more comfortable for a lot of people. So, yeah, I'm Walmart and things like Walmart worry me because I do think they have a bad influence on local businesses, but a negative impact. But lost that one.
Do any specific colorful characters stick out in your mind that live in Ashland?
Oh,
Or over the years?
oh, so many. Gosh. Oh. Certainly Nana was, I'm sure anybody you interview is probably going to remember Nana. She was a close friend and very colorful, outspoken, sort of charismatic woman. Now, I don't know why John Newell is coming to mind. That's fun. John Newell has been working as an environmentalist in Ashland, sort of behind the scenes. He was on the town council for a long time, but he's funny and has a very dry wit. I enjoy him. Other colorful people. Oh, there's so many. Susan Tucker is a hoot. She lives on Center Street. She's just so funny. And I hope somebody's interviewing her because she'll remember everything and tell it in a way that makes it funny and fun. Margaret Miller was certainly colorful. Johanna Gilhoff. Now, she was a member of the Ashland Women's Club, who was quite a character. Oh, I can't tell you her most famous story. Can't tell that. Let me think about that a little bit.
Now, who was Nana to Ashland?
Nana was an attorney, and she was on the Board of Supervisors and a judge for a little while. And her son is somebody who's now in the General Assembly. He's also active in politics. But Nana, I don't know, Nana and Sue Watson and I sort of did we all come to Ashland at the same time? I don't know, but I don't know why we sort of had sort of a tight friendship.
You mentioned your jobs earlier. Do you remember your wages at the time and how they've changed over the years to what you do now?
Oh, I don't think I'm going to be able to remember. I don't think I ever made more than $30,000 teaching school. I cannot remember what I made at the library. I was part-time, so it was an hourly wage. You can be sure that I made next to nothing at the community cooperative play school. It was probably something like $15 a month. I don't really know how much it was. I honestly don't remember my salaries. The only time I ever made any money that counted was when I worked at the Lewis Skinner Botanical Garden. So I don't, it always was pretty low.
And what's your occupation now?
I am a writer, and I have a small business called Flower Camp in Buckingham County.
Very nice. What do you know about the CCC camp?
Nothing. Civilian Conservation Corps? Is that what we're talking about? I don't know anything.
What about the buildings and roads in Ashland? Do you have any historical comments or stories about them?
Buildings and roads. I really don't. I can't think of that much change. It has really come up. I'll tell you one huge thing. I don't know whether anybody will ever else will mention it, so I will. An enormous number of trees along Railroad Avenue came down in Hurricane Isabel. I thought I will never experience that street in the same way again, and oddly, it's just amazing the way it fills in, or your memory fades or something. Now it looks beautiful to me again, but I thought it'll never be the same. But I hope somebody will in the archives put a picture, or I'm sure they did, a picture of these trees coming from each direction over the railroad tracks. It was like, I don't know, sticks, just terrible pile up of trees.
You said your parents lived in Richmond. Did they come visit you now? Or when you were raising your children?
Right. Both of my parents are dead, but they did come to visit here. And of course they had, now here's a story I bet nobody knows. Of course, Bernice Flowers was my mother's childhood friend. They grew up on North Side Richmond together. Okay, so my mother, they lived on the North Side, but both Bernice Flowers and my mother would come to Ashland for dances, big fancy dances at a house that no longer exists. It was over across the tracks, not too far here from Gwathmey. And my mother, and remember I called her Punky, Bernice Flowers, described just wild dances back there near where the Robertsons live now. I did go to I think it's part of the Chimneys still there. And they would, the Randolph-Macon boys would come. So for those girls to come out to that house that I believe burned down, to dances, when would that have been? See if my mother was 1930s, I guess. Anyway, that sounded like quite an event.
What other stories did you hear from Poppy? Why would you? Punky. Sorry.
Not many, but Punky was a businesswoman. She owned some of the buildings that are now in historic, downtown Ashland. I'm not sure which one she owned, but she was a character too. Very, a serious businesswoman at a time when not many women were. I wouldn't have wanted to mess with her.
Where did your grandparents live? Did they live in Ashland, Richmond?
I didn't know my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather grew up, she didn't grow up in Richmond. I think, where did she grow up? I'm not sure I know, but she lived in North Side Richmond most of her life. And my paternal grandfather, I didn't know him either, but my maternal grandmother lived on Henry Road in Richmond. At least by the time I was a child, she lived on Henry Road in Richmond. Here's a fun story. This doesn't relate to Ashland, but it relates to Richmond. It's near St. Christopher's, which is now considered sort of inner, pretty close to Richmond. But at the time she moved there, everybody said, "You don't want to go there. That's way too far out in the country." That they were afraid for her. So Henry Road in Richmond was once considered the boondocks part of Richmond.
How would you describe Ashland, and what does it mean to you?
I cannot imagine a better place to live. I just love it. Interesting people who care about the town. beautiful. Actually, it was prettier this spring than I believe I've ever seen it. It was a beautiful spring. We hadn't had a real spring for a while. This one's been cool and long, and things have bloomed and stayed blooming. I mean, our children grew up here, but so did John and I. I mean, we sort of married young, and so a significant portion of our lives has been spent here, and I have found it stimulating, nurturing. Never, people say about small towns, that they're not smothering or something like that. Never any of that. Anyway, it's been a great place to live.
Would you consider Ashland diverse?
Yes, absolutely. I love the way, well, now, it's probably, if you compare it to New York City, no. Although I went to an award ceremony for somebody at a school board meeting recently, and I thought, this is so wonderful. I mean, it really was so much more diverse nationality-wise than when my children went to school out here. It was always racially pretty mixed, which was wonderful. And that was one of the things I loved about Patrick Henry and Henry Clay and Gandhi for my children. I deliberately wanted them in a racially mixed environment. And they had lots of black friends. In fact, my son, from the time he was a little boy on Maple Street, the kids from Berkeley Street would come over and play football. And I still run into those kids all over town. I love it. So it has always, in my experience, felt racially mixed. There's more ethnicity now here too, which I think is good, but that's relatively new in my experience.
You said that children would come over from Berkeley Street. Was that predominantly African American society?
Yes, we lived on Maple Street, and Berkeley Street was predominantly black families, and they cut through. Well, when did they cut that road through? I'm trying to think. They probably came even before the road was cut through, but once the road was cut through, there was a easy way to get, and our backyard was the football playing place and the mulberry tree climbing place. And my husband could tell you everybody's name. Oh gosh. I hate it that I can't remember names. We can call him down if you want him to give you some names. He'd know all those kids' names. Okay.
Do you still think it's separated?
Probably some, although I went to, what was it, the Shiloh Christmas concert. Their choir did a wonderful Christmas program, and that was just wonderful. In my experience, there have been African American people. Our principal was Mr. Oh, I can't forget it. How could I possibly forget his name? I have to call John. This is ridiculous. Now I'm scared, so I'll forget everything. It'll come to me. But anyway, the wonderful, everybody will know him. He was on town council too. The principal at Henry Clay was black, and that was good for our kids to have a black person in authority from day one. There have been, people in politics. It just always felt mixed up to me, which is a good thing.
You also mentioned that you still see your children's friends in town. Do you think the majority of them remained in Ashland?
I have no idea. I would say it's probably about half and half. But this morning, I had to go to the laundromat, and there I ran into a young man who was in Jay, my son's Webelow troupe when I was the leader, the one who did the Webelows. And I probably had not seen him for 30 years. And really, I have a very bad memory, and I appreciate the fact that they have better memories than I do. And it is the most pleasant thing when he came up and said, "Miss Hugo," I just so appreciated that he, made that effort and stirred up a piece of my memory that I'd sort of lost.
he had a respect for you. When you came to visit when you were younger, was there a certain way that you were supposed to act in front of adults?
Oh, well, I was evidently a holy terror, so whatever I did was wrong. I think I was famous for being not very cooperative. Maybe that's why they sent me to Ashland. I don't know. So Funky could take care of me. I don't know. I honestly don't remember well enough. All I know is whatever was required, I didn't usually do it.
What were some of the gathering places that you and your friends would meet when your kids were growing up?
Let's see. The McGowans lived down the street from us on Maple Street, and they had fairly frequent parties. Mostly it was just the kids going from backyard to backyard. The Monroes, Bev and Stu Monroe lived across the street from us, and both their son Gavin was a friend of my son Jay's, and their daughter Shannon was a friend of my daughter Kate's, and it was just always sort of back and forth up and down the street, and there wasn't anything like a pool or we did all do things at the community center. In fact, I remember a wonderful Halloween event we all participated in at the Arts and Activities Center. That was fun. We decorated it and had little play areas for all the kids. And I remember Nana was Alice in Wonderland. The community, I guess, the Arts and Activities Center was maybe the center of most activity, because that's where the play school was, and they had art shows there and things like that. Oh, and concerts occasionally.
Since you and your husband married young and moved to Ashland, was there anything that you guys participated in as young adults that...
Okay, well, we had lived before moving here in Alabama and in California, so we weren't that young when we moved to Ashland. But neither of us have been particularly active in, community groups and that kind of thing. I was in the Ashland Women's Club, but we haven't been. We've done a few civic things, but not a whole lot.
What's the best part of Ashland?
The people, for sure. The history is fun. I think it's neat that it's a railroad town and that people care about it. History's never been one of my strongest interests, but now that I realize there's so many things I remember, I begin to get history. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Now I'm the one who's supposed to be remembering. Now it's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be lost if I don't remember it. So that's sort of neat. And it's nice that Ashland has a lot of people who've been here a long time. So there's a lot of continuity. I also like the fact that I've lived other places. I'm not sure I'd have liked it if I'd lived here always. And of course, for me, the trees. Trees are huge in my experience, and Ashland has some good ones and lots of old-fashioned plants. In fact, you could, when we lived closer to the center of town, you could sort of watch as people shared plants and they moved from garden to garden. And there's even a sort of underground history of Ashland in that you could trace who was in the garden club by who had a particular variety of daffodil or who had shared a particular shrub. You could really do that.
Since you've lived other places, a lot of people refer to Ashland as the center of the universe. How do you think about that?
It's just cute. I remember when Dick Gillis coined the term, and he was colorful. Dick Gillis, that mayor, was very colorful, very much a booster, very Chamber of Commerce. I think he had been president of the Chamber of Commerce at one time, and he was definitely a booster. And, it's fun to think that, of course, he's gone, but still, his idea, that quirky little idea, has held on, and now to see people who wouldn't have ever heard of Dick Gillis, other than knowing it's the name of the library, are over there finding Ashland on the, the round globe in front of the library and enjoying that so much. I mean, there's the power of an idea. Everybody's enjoyed that.
Ashland is famous, along with Randolph-Macon, for their ghost stories. What do you think about that? Do you have any that you can remember?
I can't remember any ghost stories. I used to hear some associated with Emily Gray's house, but I can't remember what they are.
Okay.
Well, I had told you that the Ashland trees are important to me, and this is a story that I think is worth telling. On Maple Street lived, I think it was Dr. McClurkin. I think it was John McClurkin, who was quite a horticulturist, and he had a greenhouse on the side of his house and used to air layer plants, propagate camellias and things like that. So I was very much interested in what he was doing. But his legacy, which I think is interesting, is that in front of the Arts and Activity Center, there used to be a row of very old red maple trees. And at a time when nobody was thinking about the fact that those trees were going to get old and die, he insisted that little ones be planted between them. And at the time, it looked so silly, and I'm sure it was just a hassle for the mowers, here these little saplings between some real trees. And if you go over there now, there is only one old one left, and there are 4 good-sized trees that, to my knowledge, are the ones that Dr. McClurkin insisted be planted. So that's sort of a fun thing that, while everybody's living their lives, little trees are becoming big trees. So.
Did a lot of people stop in from Ashland from the train, or did any famous people come to Ashland?
Well, when we lived at 904 South Center Street, which is a very pretty a Victorian house, and actually a lot. People would drop in and say, "Oh, I just love your house," because it was such a, sort of dramatic house. And occasionally somebody would come even and say, "We passed this house so many times on the train, we decided to come to Ashland and stop in," which was really very nice. Which reminds me of no famous people that I can think of. But this is a fun story. It shows how small the town was at one time. One of my son's friends, I guess it was his freshman year, maybe, I don't know whether it was before he was in college or maybe, I guess he was his freshman year in college. Anyway, wrote us a letter. He had come to stay with us. It must have been in high school, and come to visit him for some other reason. Anyway, he came to stay with us in that house. And it was a weekend we were making the kids clean up the attic, which was a big job. And he couldn't remember our street address. So he wrote the address something like, Mr. and Mrs. Hugo, the big Victorian house on the railroad tracks where they make the kids clean up the attic, Ashland, Virginia. And it got to us. It was so cute. Back then, the mailman would deliver anything.
That's funny. Are there any other interesting or historical stories about Randolph-Macon College? Like you mentioned the bicycle and the tree.
Well, I remember Flavia Reed Owen very well because it was she I worked for when I worked at the library. And she was another very intelligent woman who was a hard driving professional when a lot of women weren't. So Flavia, I remember very well. Other things associated with the college. Can't think of any.
I know that there's some unsolved mysteries in Ashland. Do you know anything about them?
I've heard some of those stories, and I'm not the person to ask about that. Roseanne Schauf can tell you a wonderful story about that, about those. I will tell you, because maybe no one has, next to our house at 904 South Center Street, if you looked the next lot, one lot north, same side of the street, there's a concrete stairway that leads to nothing. There are now a lot of pine trees planted there, but that concrete stairway is still there. And there used to be a house there. And that is where Katharine Hepburn lived for a while. Her father was a minister here, evidently. Now, I may be getting my facts a little bit balled up, but that was the Hepburn house. I think he was a minister here. But the house burned. The house had burned down long before we ever moved into the one next door. But that's sort of fun. It's a little vestige, just those stairs. It's like the tricycle in the tree, something to remind you of what went before.
That's wonderful.
Just be like, thank you so much, Nancy Hugo, for the interview.
Thank you so much, Nancy Hugo, for this wonderful interview. This concludes it.